Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Laurentian Home Companion, episode 2. Hey, we made it to 2 episodes. Erik, well done us. The big milestone, 2. How have you been?
I've been well, very busy, and yeah, congratulations. We haven't been canceled yet.
No, the bigwigs at McNuke's Broadcasting still see some merit in us.
Well, that's good. I think we have a lot to offer.
Well, I've had good feedback. If you're listening to this, we haven't yet put episode 1 out, but we have been focus grouping it, and we've got some good responses. So, yeah, we think we got something here. So, last time we did introductions for a bit, but we've already done that. If this is the first time that you're listening to this, go back and check out episode 1 and give that a listen. But this is going to be now a normal episode where we do Erik's journal and then the news and then finally in conversation, which we didn't get to last time. We really wanted to, but it was running long. So we're going to finally get to that this one. And we've got a really good topic, which is about the commoditization of food. And I know Erik can go on and on about that for forever. But before I let him loose, Erik, what have you got for us this week in the journal?
Well, I sent 3 pictures, and I sent 3 pictures from early in the spring to give a bit of an idea. I spoke last episode about our environment and the distance that our environment is from us. It's not something that's comprehensive. It's not national. It's not international. In fact, our environment is within any distance that we can walk within the day. So I just wanted to share some of those pictures about the environment that I have to start build that vocabulary as to what environment is and where it is around you. So the first picture that I've shown, I'm including my son in the picture, and we're just standing by the local creek during the spring runoff. So we have a spring runoff. Of course, it snows a lot here, and got a beautiful creek. It makes a very loud noise, and the kids really enjoy going down there during the spring runoff. They throw rocks. None of them have gotten in and got wet yet, but it shows the importance of water and water quality in our cycle and what we're trying to maintain in our environment, in that we have these rivers close by. They run. Things can get into those rivers and pollute them, maybe further downstream into the next picture that I have, and that's the lake picture that we have. We also live next to lots of lakes and rivers, and that's where the creek ends up. So the creek ends up in that lake, in that watershed, and we want to be able to do our best to maintain that or even improve it.
I was going to ask, because I spent some time in Australia, so I know in Australia, water rights are a big thing. And I was going to ask, do you have that creek running in from another farm, and does it run out into another farm, and whether or not in Canada, making sure a certain number of liters or megaliters going out and coming in is something that you're entitled to in Canada? Or is water just not a problem?
Water is a problem where we're farming intensively, where there's an area particularly of heavy investment. So areas, geographies, environments where farms are under heavy pressure to produce large volumes, large yields, and use all chemical and financial and institutional leverage in order to maintain and even improve those yields. Whereas the holistic accounting that we're using on our farm is very different from that. So we would take into account the water quality upstream of what we're producing. Whereas maybe if you're a commodity producer, you're not able to have those targets. You have to have production targets, and that's your sole requirement, is production and improving production volume.
Does the creek start on another farm, or does it start with you?
This isn't actually on one of our farms. This is on a neighbor's farm that we can walk to. But that creek starts in the bush or in the forest. And that creek is running off a hill down in through a pasture. And then from that pasture, it goes into a larger creek, into a large river. And then from that river, it goes into the lake of the picture that you see there with my son standing in.
And is the lake on your land?
We do own a farm on that lake, but it's some distance from our main operation.
Oh, right. So the farm isn't contiguous.
Correct. We have several places where we're in operation, but all in the same watershed nonetheless.
That's pretty common. I get a little bit frustrated. I live in a fairly decent town / city, and I have big tractors going through the town. And I do sometimes sit there and get annoyed that they're frankly bigger than the semi trucks. I'm not bolting the farmers, but I then remember, oh yeah, farms are not often contiguous. In my sort of slightly Soviet dreams, I would have some sort of farm rationalization program to make all farms contiguous. But I suspect that would create more problems than it would solve. And I'm sure you'd agree with me on that one.
Well, we could go for a deep dive on the Soviet farm system. It's not as you think it is. Those systems have a lot more to do with the food production consolidation and control within the rural villages and the cities trying to leverage that level of control of the food production from the city. That's actually a land reform subject that produced famine.
I know. It's just this picture people have in their heads that, here's Farmer Brown and he has 50 acres in a block. And it very often isn't that way. It's here's Farmer Brown and he's got 4 acres here. He's got 10 acres there. He's got bits and bobs all around and he farms whatever he can and he's grateful for it.
Yeah, that's mostly the case in Europe, in Canada, and the United States. It's different again, but we're starting to see that as land prices are more and heavily invested in by external institutions, financing institutions, starting to see that more and more in that they're starting to be broken up in different places and traveling far and wide, but that's not really what we're trying to do.
And inheritance is a big issue with that.
Yes.
The guy dies and the farm gets split up and bid on in parcels. But anyway, back to the lake. How big is this lake that I'm looking at?
So the lake itself is about, I'm going to use miles. The lake itself is about 7 miles long.
7?
Yeah, it's a very deep lake. Wow. And not very wide, bit of a sliver of a lake, but it accepts a lot of water. It's a lake that doesn't have a lot of outlets. So it's a very still lake, and it accepts a lot of water from different places, including the local villages and all the farms around in the area. And there's a great concern of blue-green algae in that lake. We have, during the hot days like we're in today, we do get a flush of blue-green algae, which can affect not only the aesthetics of the lake, but they say can be dangerous if consumed at a high level. There's not many people drinking water directly out of the lake. However, it's still a public health concern within the administration of our county. So we're trying to find ways to fix the lake. The geography of it is something you can't fix, but farmers are often blamed for are easy targets during that time for, water quality issues. When there's a cow making manure in a river or creek, they often think that that's the main culprit, or tillage and fertilizer and chemical spray. And those things are, particularly when we're talking about things like microplastics and topsoil erosion, there are issues. However, there are farmers doing more things to mitigate those issues more and more. So it's a complicated story. Our water story is a complicated story, but we definitely have to take into account all the factors, which are the people that manage that environment.
Does anyone fish out of the lake?
Big fishing lake. I catch usually about 4 or 5 perch for my kids out of the lake every year, sunfish. There's also lake trout. Smelt is in that lake, and they even say that the lake's very deep. It's about 200 feet deep, so it's in places. They even say that there's a lake monster in there. I've never seen it, but it is popular in local folklore.
Can you eat the fish with that blue-green algae issue?
Yeah, it's more of a surface issue and not something to do with what the fish are going through. But the causality of it is low oxygen in the lake itself. So the lake itself is not getting oxidized properly. There are ways around that, oxidizing it mechanically, but really getting everybody on board in the watershed, or the homeowners associations start to become powerful in the area as well. And they want to be able to dictate what they can do and what they're allowed to do, what their freedoms and rights are versus what everybody else's freedoms and rights are. But I think you and I, Rob, both agree that those things aren't the solutions to problems. Those are problems to problems.
Right. And especially at the moment, the last thing that the world needs right now is more people asserting their rights to do things. I'm not talking about freedom of speech. I'm not speaking about right to bear arms, but the right to go catch fish if you want out of a lake. You know, at the moment that we're in, I think right now we need more of an emphasis on people's responsibilities rather than people's rights.
To echo that, I think we're all subjects of a structure that needs improvement. We all know that it's going to take improvement. It's not going to be done by committee. We've all had enough committees, and committees often obfuscate decisions and obfuscate responsibilities. So we have to understand that. It's getting crunch time. We have to figure out how to get these things done and what structures work and how can we really fix these problems. Because there is time, we have space, we have responsibilities. It just takes a different way of thinking about how we can improve what we've done. And that improvement is not going to be done through giving people more power or the sense of power through individual rights. We can agree to that wholeheartedly. So the third picture we have this year is of the blood moon, and it was an interesting picture. I was out late at night. In the foreground, you can see in that picture are some weeds. In the background of that picture is, of course, the big blood moon, and then a neighbor's farm that's there. So we were out late that night making sure that we got our crop in on time, a timely part of the year, very early June. We were doing some tillage practices there so that we could get our crop in on time, and it was a beautiful picture. It was almost like the sun was shining that night. But we get to live and be able to work in an environment where we can see those things. We can really appreciate nature and all its aspects. And I always like sharing those things. I think those three pictures today are pictures of gratitude that I have for the great environment that I get to live in. And I want to share that with people, that there's some amazing and beautiful things out there that we can really appreciate in nature.
I was lucky enough to go camping this weekend in a pretty amazing setting and got a nice chance to see the stars that I don't usually get. I don't live terribly urban, but still the light pollution is such that you don't get to see many of them. And I was maybe 50 miles from where I live and much more rural. And it was very nice to get a chance to see the stars. So I can appreciate that. The big thing for me is I'm working towards getting a bit more out into nature. I don't mean day trips. I mean, I need to live a bit more rurally than I am. Oh, is that all dandelions in the foreground?
Yeah, that's all dandelions.
Wow, that is a lot.
Yeah, they were pretty heavy in that field. I'd left it last year. But that's some of our practices that we do. We see those things. We had a great crop of dandelions this year. I'll go at a quick story on dandelions. Dandelions are a sign of deficiency in the soil, particularly calcium and drainage as well. So what will happen is dandelions will become prevalent in areas where you need calcium and drainage. So the plant is telling you, or nature's telling you, that you need to do something with that part of land. So next year, what I'm hoping to do is, where I see those dandelions or the prevalence of those dandelions, is plant a brassica-based cover crop, heavy in mustard or radish, that we're able to maybe alleviate some of that weed pressure of dandelions. Also, dandelions are a great pollinator feeder. A lot of people look down on them, spray them on their lawns, but we're trying to look and how we can keep dandelions in the rotation. We try to keep dandelions in the rotation for that reason. They are a little ugly in the spring of the year, but you have to put up with those things if you're going to take responsibility. A lot of people look at the aesthetics driving through our town or our village, and they see the beautiful fields that are perfectly green and perfectly level fields that have no weeds in them, and they're beautiful. They're all uniform plant height, just wonderful, beautifully aesthetic fields. The amount of effort and externalities that those fields produce aren't being accounted for at this time. And we're looking to change the aesthetic nature that we're producing, and that will reflect in the environmental externalities that we're creating as well.
What stands out to me is two things from that. One is, it reminds me of a saying that I heard, that I can't remember where I got this from. There's no such thing as a weed. There are plants that you want there, and there are plants that you don't want there. And we call plants that we don't want there weeds, and everything else is good. So you have to sort of redefine, reconceptualize your attitude towards some of these plants. And that leads into the second point, which is nature is speaking to us. It's just that we're not listening. And the dandelion example about what you talked about what it's saying, is really interesting and significant. If you just know how to listen, it'll tell you a lot.
That's what we're finding out, Rob. We're going back to some of these practices. We're under production practices now and structures that are telling us different things, but we're going back to understanding a little better as to what really management is and what really responsible management is and how to handle those situations.
The news. So I have a little bit of local news. Very sad to say that my little organic local food shop is closing in the not too distant future. I'm very upset about it. So now I have to source my whole milk from somewhere else, my unpasteurized whole milk. But it's a real shame. It was a great little store, but I was talking to the guy today and he said that that they haven't recovered from COVID in terms of people spending. And I thought that was a bit odd. I said to him, I would have thought people would be spending more money now at a place like this rather than less. And he said, yeah, but their budgets have been hit. So just a small little community notice to go out and support local food stores because they're who the local farmers sell to. So go out and patronize them.
It's funny, it's a double-edged sword here that we're seeing post-COVID. We're seeing inflation prices for food go through the roof. And we're seeing those food, like, I don't know, fast food restaurants are 20-30% more expensive for a hamburger. And that hasn't slowed people down from eating at McDonald's or Burger King. But the price point on domestically supplied food rather than commodity supplied food is starting to narrow. So we're starting to see those two things get a lot closer, where in fact the economics are getting better and better for domestic food production, whereas commodity food production, things are getting higher and higher. So I think there's a double-edged sword in that, the small or the local food movement will never be able to compete with those large corporate entities or rents or anything of that nature. But I think what we can compete in is the door-to-door delivery or the door-to-freezer delivery, or what we call land to market, which is a wonderful opportunity that's expanding at a rapid pace everywhere throughout the Western world.
In properly now, the news, I wanted to start in New Zealand this week, if it's all the same to you, Erik. So let me sketch out 3 articles I came across. We're kind of spoiled for choice this week from New Zealand. I think it's particularly a big time in New Zealand for agricultural policy. A big champion of New Zealand agriculture, Winston Peters, is now gone. I'm not sure if he's still in Parliament, but he's no longer the deputy PM. He was the kingmaker for New Zealand governments for a bit, and he's now gone. He was a big champion of agriculture. And so the Arden government, or the Arden Babysitters Club, is now taking advantage of that to ram through some policies. So we've got a lot of stuff on the table from New Zealand this week. So I'm going to give you 3 articles, and I want you to hold off in reacting to them and react to them as a whole. So the first headline is, and this is from The Guardian, and I don't like going to The Guardian, but they do a pretty good job at covering stuff in most English-speaking countries now, and they're free, and I want to give you guys sources that aren't behind paywalls. So this is from The Guardian. New Zealand farmers have avoided regulation for decades. Now their bill has come due. And this article was talking about what we talked about last time, this regulation that the government's putting through. There's a big increase. And the argument from this article was that, look, farmers could have had an easier time of things if they'd let smaller reforms go through in the past and have a sort of incremental buildup. But now, because they've put that off and because we have New Zealand's babysitter ready to go, they're getting a whole big dose of reforms right now. And this leads into the next one, which is from, a very weird sounding website, but it is pretty good for news. It's called stuff.co.nz. And the title is Pay Farmers $12 billion to Stop Dairying, Ecologist Urges. So dairy farms, the argument goes, are polluting waterways in New Zealand, and largely from, quote, synthetic nitrogen. Now, I don't think that has anything to do with cattle waste products, but rather fertilizers. The idea is a one-off payment to get dairy farmers to switch to other forms of agriculture. This article wasn't too clear. I get the sense that the proposal is more nuanced. It's to stop dairy farmers farming in certain areas that the water tables are really messed up. The article says that about 1/3 of New Zealand waterways are unfit to swim in for at least part of the year, and some of them are terrible. The chemical levels, the only rivers in the world that do any worse than them are the Yangtze and the Pearl River in China. And it's a pretty big indictment of New Zealand's waterway management if it is that bad. But this might not be so bad as the headline suggests because of significant proportions of dairy going into junk food fillers or breast milk replacements. I'm not so worried about those products as long as I can still down my liter of milk. And I'd rather have New Zealand farmers farming real food than just pumping out massive amounts of dairy that go into stupid things like that. Lastly, from New Zealand, there's much clutching of pearls about cow farts. Well, actually, from what I gather, it's more cow burps that are the problem. And here's the headline. This is again from The Guardian. Emissions from cows on New Zealand dairy farms reach record levels. I won't go into this one too much, only to say that livestock emit 14.5% of greenhouse gases globally. And the proportion that New Zealand produces, I'm not sure what they produce of that per year globally, but they do have more cows than people in New Zealand. New Zealand has experienced an increase of about 3.2%. This is a weird one. So, Erik, I put these through to you to try and navigate a middle line. I often say I'm a micro-environmentalist. I want the land to be healthy. I don't want coal power stations making acid rain. But these big macro claims about carbon parts per million make my eyes glaze over. So yes, farming practices need to change. Waterways need to be healthy. But cow burps, to me, I think it defeats what they're trying to achieve. And I think it makes a farce of it all. How is anyone skeptical of the environmental movement and its goals supposed to take it seriously when they can't stop talking about silly things like you have to eat less meat because cows are burping too much?
You've left a lot for me to unpack there, Rob. I will do my best to understand how.
There's just so much from New Zealand, and it all sort of worked together.
I know, and I've got a lot to say in response to it, but I will likely veer off incoherently for a couple minutes here, if you'll allow. I'll try and keep your attention and try to answer your questions because you've done a lot, and I think it speaks a lot to not only issues in New Zealand, but issues throughout the world through all policymaking apparatus. And I think ultimately what it comes down to is you've got poor systemic design by low character people making these decisions and really not understanding the nuance of what they're trying to do. You've got to understand, to add a little bit of context, at one time in the early 90s, New Zealand went bankrupt. One of the main strategies that they employed in New Zealand to bring themselves out of bankruptcy was agricultural production. And they looked at what they had and they set to it. And they grew the fourth largest meat producer now and the largest dairy exporter in the world. They had a centralized, controlled system through Fonterra, which markets the most dairy throughout the world, next to the United States. Regardless of the actual numbers, and that's something I think we need to avoid is calculating volumes and calculating export statistics and the amount of carbon footprint that we make. All these hypothetical models aren't telling the full story of what that is. The story of New Zealand itself is the hypothetical models that we are creating in the subsidiary power structures are not telling the full story. And through employing methods such as carbon capture, through employing methods as billion-dollar bailouts, we're continuing the same irresponsible structures that were in place. Heavily bureaucratized, low producers' incentives. In fact, last week, the news out of New Zealand was that there was massive protests by producers, and we see those massive protests still going on for months in India when it comes to their land reform policies. An absolute lack of understanding of the countryside and what it takes to facilitate some of these changes that are required to happen. You do have farmers who want to do these things. You do have farmers that want to make a living, but they're not going to be on board with these structures if you don't have an idea how to speak to them, how to use their vernacular, the understanding of the structures that were in place that Mr. Winston Peters put in place and made New Zealand what it is today. There are definitely pushback from producers that will want to stop these reforms, but the top-down approach that the Babysitters Club has in New Zealand is not the answer. They've obviously pitted rural against urban. They've hinted to that again and again, but they have to find a way, a middle ground, and that's what I'm here to present, a middle ground that can make these land reform policies work so that we don't have Soviet Union-style food production and that competition between the rural and the urban, which is a major part of a lot of the conflicts that we're seeing today if we zoom out from New Zealand. Now, the New Zealand dairy industry, there's research-based organizations that are backed by finance that do these papers, that write white papers to solve the questions of these governments. And governments like Jacinda Ardern's government really take heavy stock in those white papers that are backed by finance. So we really start to see the structure of how these policies come together, where you have these finance-backed organizations that write these research papers and then propose them to the subsidiary powers within a government. The leadership then takes those policy proposals and tries to enact them point blank. The reforms may be necessary, but how they go about it is really backwards. And you have people from Oxford, very smart, intelligent people from the major universities, Oxford, Queen's in Canada, McGill University, publishing these papers when they haven't gotten their hands dirty or they really lack the understanding of the intricacies and the importance of the food system. So that's what we're seeing now. We're starting to understand those things better as farmers, and we're going to be able to produce a product that has stewardship standards that are going to exceed the past, that are going to deliver healthy products for your community and outside your community. And hopefully that whole milk that you're drinking, Rob, will never be in jeopardy again. That you'll be able to access those things a lot easier through home delivery or whatever system it is. We're really working on a lot of these farmers, a lot of the young farmers, the next generation. We're working on a lot of these issues right now, and we aren't really involving any type of government power in order to do so.
So moving on, in the UK, a report has come out from the Board of Trade headed by Liz Truss, MP, which argues over the environmental sustainability of buying local. And I quote from the report, "Why buying local is not always the most environmentally sustainable choice. While buying locally produced food can be better for the environment than buying imports, this is not always the case. First, transport emissions often only account for a small proportion of the total emissions required to produce a good. So if a good is produced more efficiently overseas, it can be better for the environment to buy imports. Second, production techniques vary wildly, meaning that products that look identical can have very different environmental footprints. Third, trade enables countries to import counter-seasonal produce rather than relying on energy-intensive cold storage or artificial growing technique?
Well, my response to that is that's a press release from an organization that wants to maintain the current hegemony in food imports and processed foods. So
it's funny you say that because it's from the British government.
yes, well, they have their interests too, don't they? So yes, it's a press release from an organization that wants to maintain hegemony, and they don't understand. And again, going back to the issues in New Zealand, it's the same thing. In these are the people that are making your food policies. They don't concern themselves with actual results or accountability. It seems to be that that's just beyond their purview of their job description. So we're having to work outside these current structures, and the British government, of course, is one of them. And how they choose to have press releases or the subjects that they choose to release will be up to them. But the good news is that more and more people are realizing how foolish they are and how much more expensive commodity food is becoming at the grocery store. People don't really think about it. They think a hamburger at McDonald's is cheap or Burger King is cheap, and that's just not the case anymore.
So, small one from Australia. Goat listings surge as red meat momentum builds. So it's interesting to see a growing interest in other types of meat. But then Aussies have always been a bit adventurous in what they're prepared to eat. Just Google bush tucker and witchetty grubs if you want to see what an Australian will put in their mouth.
I guess it beats the mangrove worms if you're eating bush tucker. But yeah, don't Google eating mangrove worms.
I have to now.
Don't Google it now. Please don't. As realizations come, wild meat becomes more available, how delicious it is. And we want to, as farmers, create meat for you that's as wild as possible, but without maybe some of the risks involved with that either.
Now, over to your neck of the woods, Canada. There was a pretty decent article or it seemed to me a pretty decent article from New York Times. The headline is Farmers Race to Save Their Cattle from Canada's Drought. Things are looking bleak out in Manitoba. The ongoing drought has meant that farmers are struggling to grow feed for their cattle. This is putting them into a downward spiral, with it looking like the end for many farms. Decrease in feed production means feed prices are going up, a cost usually internalized to the farm itself, now having to be met by farmers already struggling to make ends meet. This means many are putting their cows up for auction, which is driving down the price they can get for their cows. Kirk Kaisman, general manager at the Ashern Auction Market, livestock auction house in the region, said, quote, "No one wants to see their genetic potential being turned into meat," which I thought was a pretty good quote. These are herds that have been bred for generations, and putting aside the family tragedy that this represents, it's a tragedy for the herds and business, because if they get back up and running, they're going to have to start all over from scratch, breeding up a new herd. Now, do you think that the New York Times has misrepresented things, or do you think that's a pretty accurate one from them?
I'm not a reader of the New York Times on a regular basis. I'm not one to judge, but anything I have read from the New York Times, I take with, or the old lady as they call it, I take with a lot of skepticism, we'll say, and that maybe they're the journalists that lead the way, but maybe the ones with the most agenda. And I think this article is a great case in point, and they choose when and who to focus their attention on, and the utility that they bring into account as to why farmers are selling their cattle early and having to deplete their herds. I will say that this happens often, that depleting your herd is not something, it's terrible. It's not something that we want to do as farmers, especially beef farmers in times like now. But the New York Times is strangely focusing on words like drought and climate change instead of the monopolies that have overtaken the meat industry, where there's no place for those animals to go and get turned into meat. The feed prices are high because we're shipping our soy in record amounts to China. We have animal breeds that are based on grain rations, and the whole system is weakened not by drought itself per se, which can be an annual issue, or maybe drought you can suffer, don't get me wrong, but it's not the systemic issue that's leading to the pressure that the food system is under.
To be fair to the New York Times, I don't know how they cover those other issues you're talking about, but
Well, they don't.
You're right. It certainly suits their narrative that they're pushing.
We'd be talking about the actual reality of the situation instead of the climate change narrative that they're trying to promote through the New York Times in Manitoba. Manitoba, if you don't know, is far away from New York. Nobody, I'm sure, at the New York Times even knows anyone in Manitoba.
I don't think they'd ever heard in Manitoba before.
Well, it's Canada's bathtub, and they say that themselves, so I'm not speaking out of turn. But nobody from New York knows anybody from Manitoba, so nobody can do their own research. They maybe know it exists. There's some great people in Manitoba that I know that are suffering through drought, but they always suffer and they always persevere. It doesn't serve the immediate utility of the New York Times or that climate change narrative to promote those ideas of maybe changing things in a different way, but it does utilize the climate change narrative for what their other articles are promoting.
U.S., again, there's really nothing interesting coming out of the U.S. We'll do an extended conversation on this in the near future, I think. But it seems like the agricultural sector is very corporate, as Erik said last time, and keeps a tight lid on things, which is why we're not hearing so much about them. That's what it seems to me. That's the theory that I'm working on. But there's just not the topics, really, that I'm finding. For New Zealand, a country of 5 million people, thereabouts, so what, 1/60th? I think I've done my math right on that. Has so much more going on in its agricultural news than the U.S. does. It's just a bit weird, and I think I have to chalk that up to more corporate farming.
What we're learning, Rob, is that institutions do have power and they use those things to leverage their power. One thing I will say out of the U.S. is that China is buying a lot of soy and corn. We're seeing record prices in soy and corn. We're seeing record inflation in the grocery stores for meat and all foods across the board. Yet farmers are still suffering on the farm. They can't make ends meet, and it's getting, instead of high prices or better times, it's high prices are the same. They're maintaining the hegemony, and that's what we seem to find with American agriculture. A lot of great people down there doing great things, but yeah, it's a volume business in the United States.
Now we're into the meat of the show that we didn't get to last time. So I'm going to give a little overview of what we're going to be talking about. It's similar to the news, but just more in depth. Here it is. We are in a commodity crisis. Wait, what's a commodity? It's a sort of word that gets thrown around, but do you really know what it means? Adam Smith had a definition for commodities. Karl Marx had one, which revolved around the output of labor. But nowadays, we use the term to refer to a raw material that is traded on markets. Your car isn't a commodity, but the steel that goes into, or used to before they started building them from plastic, and the gas that powers it are commodities. Corn, rice, soybeans, milk, hogs, cattle, ethanol are all commodities that are traded. And there's one place where you can trade all of them and more: Chicago. London means insurance, New York means stocks, but Chicago is commodities. And it makes sense. Look at a map. It's a port city on the Great Lakes, and it's surrounded by one of the most agriculturally productive places in history, if not the most agriculturally productive place in history. North and east of it are some of the most industrially productive places that churned out the world's machines and consumer goods, until we let China make them all for us. But wait, commodity prices are going up, Rob. That's not a crisis. Crises are when commodities collapse. Okay, well, when you talk like that, you're thinking like a commodity trader that are leveraged into markets that are ruining their end of year. But if we're going to think like economists, we need to think like economists at the village, or I would say shire level. And at the shire level, we are in a commodity crisis. Look at lumber. Look at the price of gas. When you can't afford to buy wood or power transportation, that's a crisis. It's just going the other way, the way that benefits institutional investors, but it's not good for us. When distributors of lumber are buying it back because they expect the price to go up further, which has been happening recently, it shows that the economy may not be quite as rational as we like to think. Neither undervalued or overvalued commodities is good. If they're undervalued, there will be a boom in production until commodity producers stop, which they will when it becomes economically unviable to get that raw material out of wherever it is into the markets. If they're overvalued, production will slow down. The point is both produce different crises. But this isn't about economics. This is about the big picture, and the economy is just one piece of that puzzle. Erik, as a real honest-to-goodness farmer, has a better understanding of that puzzle than I or most likely you do, as people who only come into contact with the things we eat when we buy them vacuum-packed at the store. And he has a perspective on the consumption of commodities that will inform a lot of the things we talk about in future episodes. So we decided to start here. Now, Erik, you've heard how I've described commodities. What do you have to say?
Rob, the question I'd like to ask is, can you eat those things that are traded on the Chicago Board of Trade? Would you put oil in your mouth? Would you eat iron ore? You can eat dairy, you can eat corn and soy, but they're produced under the same business model as our oil, as our minerals, as a lot of things that we use for trade value. Our food is produced under the same business model. So once we start thinking about how our food is produced, we can maybe draw a differential line between the two, of commodity and of food. It's my belief that food is something that nourishes you, that makes you healthy, not something that has the opportunity to make you sick. Watching and reading some of the news articles on food production, more and more doctors and medical professionals are looking towards food and the foods we do eat now, currently, the commodities we do eat now, as being poisonous to us. Take sugar, for example. Even take some of the products that we promote and watch how they're produced. Maybe there's a different way that we can separate, and I think the definitions of food and commodity are the way that we can separate the two production methods and the effort and the understanding of what goes behind them.
So why specifically do you have a problem, though, with food being traded as a commodity? What does it do to food?
Well, it's not the fact that it's being traded that way. It's how it's being treated. And the fact that you're taking a business model of mass production of basically resource extraction to produce corn and to produce soybeans the same way that oil is being produced, volume at all costs, can lead to some problems. So it's not necessarily that I have anything personal against it. It's the fact that the way the structure is being withheld. And understanding that structure is what we're trying to do. And putting definitions about it and separating the difference between commodity and food is what we're trying to do. An issue that we're trying to put forward in this podcast going forward.
It's just an issue of quality, though. Is if you can produce good food as a commodity, isn't that okay? Or is the system of commodity antithetical to quality food?
I take the latter answer to that, and I can expand on that. In that, when a lot of these products or innovations came out at the start, there wasn't an issue, say, with something like chemical production, because they were used at reasonably low levels. They were easy to afford. There was no such thing as seed treatments on corn. There was no genetic modification, which allowed you to spray large amounts of chemicals on the corn and actually start polluting using herbicides. I would say that we've made it a long way in herbicide production and protection, but we've also gone backwards in the amount of herbicides that we use as well. We don't use atrazine as much anymore, but we do use a lot more Roundup. And it was a bait and switch almost by industry in order to allow for chemical production, not only to increase yields, but to not only to maintain yields, and increase yields, but to make it easier for the farmers who have a lot of stress and a lot of workload, it's definitely these chemicals, what we call pushing the easy button. So when you have those incentives in the market, and I hesitate to even call it a market at this point, when you have those incentives in those production practices, it makes it difficult to do anything else but produce a commodity with a lot of externalities attached to it. There is no incentive to produce high quality, very little, unless you're going land to market or farm to table, and using those business practices and structures in order to produce food instead of a commodity.
If I can put it a different way, it seems like commodity production of things that we eat encourages a bottom line focus and not a focus on quality or process. And if you can sell 10 bushels of wheat of a low quality as a commodity, then the commodity mindset encourages that, as opposed to 5 bushels of wheat at a much better quality. Do you think that's a fair assessment or a fair description of the mindset that it creates?
I think it definitely is, Rob, but we have to understand, we have to put metrics around what quality means. And currently, quality means a high price, high production. And those are the incentives that are in the system now. Not to our surprise, those are the ones that are being followed by farmers, including myself. So we need to have an understanding of exactly what quality means. We almost have to commodify quality instead of commodifying volume. So there's a definite need for some of those metrics and those understanding in order to make commodities food again. But we've got to put in the work, and we've got to have some of those structures that incentivize that for farmers, for people producing our food. Not just those people in the cities, or not just those enterprises that are using commodities as food and putting them in your grocery store. We need to learn to find ways to incentivize to do things better and higher quality instead of producing just volume.
I'll use chicken as an example. The difference between chicken as commodity and chicken as food is a $5 chicken versus a $20 chicken. But if you go and look at the way that the $5 chickens are raised, you don't want to eat them. But if you go and look at the way the $20 chickens are raised, they're raised in a much more humane way. And not only that, but when you actually do chemical analyses of the meat or nutritional analysis of the meat, the more expensive chicken is significantly better. And there's a great book I recommend people check out called Farmageddon. It is on Audible. And there's a fact that's thrown out that an organic free-range chicken has about 3 times the amount of nutrition in it that a factory farm battery-raised chicken has. So there is a trade-off in cost, but you are getting more for that increased price.
I'd argue, Rob, that $5 chicken is costing you just as much as that $20 chicken. The externalities are removed and they're put in the hands of the consumer, and the consumer is the same person that pays taxes. The consumer is the same person that maybe contributes to an environmental cause, and that consumer is the same person whose health benefits from those things or health costs relate to it. So I think with your $20 chicken, it's taking into account the full scope of the externalities that they're being produced. And the more and more we're learning about food science, the less and less we're learning to eat. I'm not someone to judge anybody on their diet choices, but we can choose to eat really great tasting local food. Maybe not all the time. Maybe we can't afford to eat it all the time. I know I don't. I'm not able to. But what we're really trying to do is to promote including that in some of your diet and why you're including that, why you're eating it, what the stakes are, pardon the pun, what the stakes are really behind what you're putting in your mouth, both commodity-based and food-based food. So helping people understand that and navigate through some of the decisions that they have to make in purchasing decisions. And really, if as things get tighter in the world, ways that we can improve our lives. And I think food has the opportunity to do that.
The externalities is the big thing, isn't it? Because they both cost something. And the benefit of spending $20 on a chicken is that you're spending $20 on a chicken, which doesn't sound like a benefit. That sounds like an expensive chicken. But when you consider what the costs are compared to the $5 chicken, where the production of that chicken is not good for the environment. And I say that, what I said earlier, I'm a macro environmentalist. So at the small level, it is being really bad for the environment. And food as commodity doesn't care about those costs. Food as commodity is just about producing. And one of the things you will hear the factory farming industry throw out there is, yeah, but we're more efficient. They're not. They use more land than a local family farm does, rearing chicken, rearing beef, rearing pork. The way they get that, I'm not going to say lie, but that piece of misinformation to you is by going, look at my shed. That's all the land that I use. What they don't factor into that is the acres and acres and hundreds of miles of monoculture soy, monoculture corn that they're growing in Argentina and Brazil and the United States in order to ship wherever you are to feed to those factory farm chickens. When you factor that in, they are much less efficient. And the externalized costs are going to come to your health and to the environment. And at the end of the day, you are going to wish that you spent $20 on that chicken. This goes into something that I'm concerned about, that we are living in a bubble, or the opposite of a bubble, I guess. We are currently at a historical low point in how much we spend on food. No generation previous to us throughout human history has spent so little on food, and that includes the amount of time that they spent gathering it. We spend 16% of our household income on food these days. Your grandparents 60 years ago spent 33% of that, so it's half. Now, if you doubled your food budget tomorrow, I'm sure you would be able to eat better. And if you started cutting out those trips to KFC and you started buying real chicken and using the whole thing, so you have a roast chicken on Sunday, and then you have chicken sandwiches for lunch for 2 or 3 days, and then you have chicken soup by Friday, and you really make that food that you're buying go the distance, you're going to find that you're spending more money than you are now, but you're eating better, and you'll probably be healthy. So I would make that argument as well, that goes with it. You know, at the end of the day, bad corn, right, mass-produced corn that isn't worthy of being eaten, it lends itself to being turned into corn syrup that then gets pumped into, Coke. And I love Coca-Cola as much as anyone. My friends will tell you I drink far too much of it, and I've really made an effort to cut it out. But these subpar food that's been produced as a commodity feeds a lot of the shitty stuff that we consume as well.
Well, I have nothing to add to that, Rob. You certainly summarized it pretty far, but I might add one thing, and one selfish, in the fact that how much these commodities actually destroy the farms and environment where food can be produced. And that it's not benefiting farmers, it's not benefiting rural communities. Most of that money is being stripped from these communities, it's stripped from these farms, and being given to these large corporations who are the ones who are benefiting. In their benefit, in their defense, they have come up with these wonderful technologies to produce these amounts of food that we have never seen before in our lives. the amounts of food have never been seen before in history. We are more stable now than we ever have been in terms of food production for volume. But when it comes to quality and the externalities that our food system produces, we may be too far down the road to get back to where we were. If we lose our farms, if we lose any more of our farms and another generation isn't able to change the way, or the next generation isn't able to change that they produce and consume food, we don't know what the answers are. I don't like being an alarmist, but that is the only thing that I would add, Rob, other than you've covered most of the subjects under commodity. You must have a good teacher in that understanding.
Everything I know from you.
I kind of set you up for that, didn't I?
Yep, and I'm leaving that in. Is there anything else, or I feel like that's a good place to leave it?
I think that's a perfect place to leave it, and I'm going to go now. I've got more farming to do, and we'll talk to you next time, guys. Please keep tuned. Keep your ear to the ground. We've got lots going on at the Iron Age Archive, and we'll have more good stuff coming soon.
Thanks, guys.